Good morning and welcome to the first in what we hope will be a series of videos on how to work various knitting and crocheting techniques. In this first video, we will address how to knit a gauge swatch. Let's settle two commonly asked questions. First of all, do I need to work a gauge swatch? Absolutely. Is it difficult? No, not if you follow a few simple guidelines. A proper gauge is crucial to the correct fit of any garment, be it a sweater, a hat, or even a tea cozy. Many people tell me, oh, I never do a gauge. I'm just knitting a scarf or an afghan. Yes, it is true that the world is not going to implode if your scarf is 4.5 inches wide when it's supposed to be 5 inches wide. However, you should want to know how the resulting fabric is going to look and behave. Many times I've worked a swatch for a scarf and decided either that the yarn didn't work well with the pattern or the colors didn't work well together. Now let's get down to business. First of all, read your pattern. The pattern I'm using today is for a baby blanket. Hopefully you've already selected your yarn for your project. I happen to be using the yarn that the pattern calls for, which is Plymouth Encore. I could substitute another yarn, worsted weight yarn, such as Plymouth Galway, Cascade 220, or Barocco Comfort, but I need to do the gauge swatch in the yarn that I'm going to use for my project. Which brings us to needles. My pattern calls for size 9 needles. I need to use the needles that I'm actually going to use in the project. For example, if I intend to use bamboo needles for my project, I wouldn't use metal or plastic needles for my gauge swatch. Different types of needles can cause your knitting tension to vary. I think for this project, I'm going to use bamboo. So that's what I'm going to do my gauge swatch on. Look on your pattern for the gauge. On a British pattern, it will say tension. It's the same thing. This pattern says that my gauge should be, and it's right down here, 16 stitches equals 4 inches over stockinette stitch on number 9 needles, or size to obtain gauge. This is so important. Some people get really hung up on the idea that they have to use size 9 needles, and this is why we do a gauge swatch, to see if that's the proper needle for you to use, because we all knit differently, some tighter, some looser than others. The other important thing to note is the gauge swatch is to be worked in stockinette stitch. You must work the gauge swatch in the proper stitch. Sometimes the pattern will say something like a certain number of stitches equals 4 inches in pattern stitch. You then need to read through the pattern and find what the pattern stitch is and work your gauge swatch in that. How big should your gauge swatch be? Sometimes the pattern will say that your gauge should be X number of stitches to 1 inch. Do not work a gauge swatch over 1 inch. It's simply too small to be accurate. Cast on enough stitches to measure at least 4 inches. Again, my pattern says that 16 stitches equals 4 inches. I'm going to add 2 stitches to that number, cast on 18 stitches, and work my gauge swatch in stockinette. I'll explain later why I added the 2 stitches. If your pattern gauge says, for example, 5.5 stitches equals 1 inch, you would take 5.5, multiply it by 4, and then add 2 stitches to that. So you would cast on 24 stitches. Some patterns will give a row gauge as well. Some will not if the row gauge is not crucial. Knit at least 3 inches to have the swatch big enough to measure. You can bind off or leave the swatch on the needles. So let's get started, and I'll see you back here when you've got your swatch finished. Now we're ready to measure our gauge swatch and make adjustments if necessary. You'll need your swatch. Some T-pins or large blunt needles will work as well. You'll also need something to measure with, a ruler or a tape measure. Lay your swatch out on a flat surface. Take one pin and place it in between the first and the second stitch. Now your first stitch is way on over here on the edge, and it's trying to curl under because that's what stockinette stitch does. This is my second stitch. If you can see it, there's a letter V. Looks like a letter V. So I'm going to go right in between here and place that pin. Then I'm going to come over here on the other side and do the same thing, placing a pin in between. This is my next to the last stitch. See, there's the V, and here's the last stitch. I'm going to place a pin right in between those two. Remember when I added the 2 stitches onto the number to cast on? Here's why. If you look at these edge stitches on either side, they, first of all, they tend to curl under. They are a little bit twisted, they're a little bit distorted. They may not give you an accurate reading, so we'll just leave the first and last stitches out of it and measure what's in between. Now I'm going to take my ruler and I'm going to measure in between the pins. I'm going to line this edge of the ruler where the measurement begins right there Line that up with this pin, measure over to this pin. Now if you can see where the pin's a little bit twisted, but you can see where the pin falls just slightly short of 4 inches. It's actually about, oh, I'd say maybe 3 7/8, which is pretty close. And for something like a baby blanket, may be accurate enough for what you want. If it was a garment, you might want to make some adjustments at this point. My gauge measures less than 4 inches, so that means that I need to do another gauge swatch, and you do it in a needle size that's larger. For example, the next size up for mine would be a size 10. Don't just grab your size 10 needles and start knitting. You need to do another gauge swatch, because sometimes what will happen is that gauge swatch will end up being much bigger, and then you're going to have to make a decision. On the other hand, if my gauge swatch had measured more than 4 inches, say it measured 4.5 inches, then I would want to consider doing a gauge swatch and moving down a needle size. But I still need to do another gauge swatch. A lot of people will say something like, well, I'll just knit tighter, or I'll just knit looser. Your body has a memory. If you've been knitting for any length of time at all, your body has already got that into its memory. And you can sit down and you can consciously say, I am going to knit tighter. And you might knit like that for a while, but then you're going to relax, or there'll be a distraction or something, and your body will go back to what it knows already, what's already been ingrained in it, and it will go back to your old way of knitting, and then your gauge has changed and your garment is not going to fit. It's much easier to change your needle size than it is to change the way that you knit. Again, because mine is so close, I would probably just stay with what I've got, but I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to try another gauge swatch using my Addi Turbo needles and see if that changes things at all just by knitting on a different type of needle. So I'll be back to check with you on that. Okay, here we are back again to check the second swatch. Remember, this is still a size 9, but I worked it on the Addi Turbos, on the slippery needles, to see what kind of a difference that might possibly make. So again, I'm going to place my needle, my pin, between the first and second stitches, and between the last and the next to the last stitch. And yes, the edges are going to curl and roll, and just sort of wrestle it around and deal with it. Don't ever iron or steam your swatch. Okay, so here's my ruler, lined up here, lined up here. Didn't really change a whole lot. It's about the same, it measures about the same. But I'm still glad that I did this gauge swatch, because I like the resulting fabric much better. It's much smoother, and my stitches look more even when I work them on the Addi Turbo needle as opposed to when I work them on the bamboo. And I don't know if you can see this on a two-dimensional video, but this was my sample with the bamboo. This is my sample with the Addi Turbo. So even though my gauge didn't really change, I still think I'm going to go with the Addi Turbo, and I think I'll stay with the size 9 needle.